Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. I never thought a spilled glass of orange juice would be the moment everything changed. But there I was, on my hands and knees at 56 years old, cleaning up the mess while Mrs. Henderson stood over me, her voice sharp as winter wind, telling me how clumsy I'd become and how lucky I was she didn't dock my pay. My name is Suzie, and for the past 8 years, I'd been working as a live-in caregiver for the Henderson family. What started as a dignified position, helping care for their autistic son, Marcus, had slowly transformed into something I barely recognized. I wasn't just a caregiver anymore. I was their maid, their cook, their verbal punching bag, and apparently, their scapegoat for every small inconvenience that disrupted their perfectly manicured lives. The Henderson mansion sat like a fortress on Elm Ridge. All marble columns and manicured lawns. The kind of place that screamed old money and older attitudes. When I first answered their advertisement 8 years ago, I'd been desperate. My husband had passed from cancer, leaving me with medical bills that devoured our savings and a grief so heavy I could barely function. The job seemed like providence. Live-in position, caring for a special needs child, working for one of the wealthiest families in the county. The salary was generous, the accommodations comfortable, and Marcus, their 12-year-old son, needed someone who understood patience and compassion. Marcus wasn't like other children. He lived in his own world, one filled with intricate patterns and routines that couldn't be disrupted without consequences. He rarely spoke, communicated mostly through gestures and sounds, and had meltdowns that could last for hours if his environment changed unexpectedly. But there was something beautiful about him too. Something pure and untouched by the cruelty of the world. When he smiled, which happened mostly when he was arranging his collection of colored stones or watching the way sunlight moved across the wall, it was like witnessing magic. I connected with Marcus immediately. Maybe it was because we were both outsiders in that grand house. Or maybe because I recognized something in his eyes that mirrored my own sense of displacement. While his parents, Richard and Patricia Henderson, spoke about him as if he were a problem to be managed, I saw a child who simply experienced the world differently. I learned his rhythms, anticipated his needs, and slowly, carefully, built a relationship based on trust and understanding. The first year was everything I'd hoped for. The Hendersons treated me with respect, acknowledged my expertise with Marcus, and seemed genuinely grateful for the stability I brought to their household. Marcus thrived under my care. His meltdowns became less frequent. He began showing affection in his own subtle ways, and even started making small attempts at verbal communication. But success, I learned, can be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. The second year brought subtle changes. Patricia began asking me to handle small household tasks beyond Marcus's care. Just light housekeeping, she said. Since I was already there, nothing major. Richard started expecting me to prepare meals for the family, not just Marcus's specialized diet. They were busy people, they explained. Important people with demanding careers and social obligations. Surely I understood. And I complied. After all, they were paying me well, and I genuinely cared about Marcus. If taking on additional responsibilities meant I could continue providing him with the care he needed, it seemed like a reasonable compromise. Besides, the alternative was returning to job hunting in my late 40s, competing with younger candidates in a market that had little patience for women like me. The changes accelerated in the third year. My living quarters, originally a comfortable guest suite, were relocated to a smaller room near the kitchen. More practical, Patricia explained, since I'd be spending more time in that area of the house anyway. My schedule extended from early morning until late evening. The boundaries between caregiver, housekeeper, and cook blurred until they disappeared entirely. But it was the way they spoke to me that hurt most. The respectful tone of our early relationship gave way to dismissive commands and casual criticism. Patricia developed a habit of pointing out every perceived failing, from dust on a bookshelf to Marcus's occasional difficult days, as if his autism was somehow my fault. Richard barely acknowledged my existence, speaking about me in third person, even when I was standing right there. The worst part was how they discussed Marcus in my presence, as if he couldn't understand their words. They talked about his limitations, their disappointments, their hopes that someday he might be normal enough to not embarrass them in public. They spoke of residential facilities and special schools as if they were discussing boarding kennels. Each word was like a knife to my heart, not just for Marcus's sake, but because I recognized the casual cruelty of people who had never learned to value what didn't fit their narrow definition of worth. By the 4th year, I'd become invisible, not just to the Hendersons, but somehow to myself as well. I moved through that enormous house like a ghost, cleaning and cooking and caring without complaint, swallowing every small humiliation, justifying every erosion of my dignity with the same refrain: Marcus needs me. And he did need me. I was the only constant in his life, the only person who saw past his differences to the remarkable child beneath. The 5th year brought new indignities. Patricia began entertaining more frequently, hosting charity luncheons and dinner parties for her social circle. During these events, I was expected to serve as an invisible presence, refilling glasses and clearing plates while being spoken about as if I were furniture. I heard their conversations about their servants, the challenges of finding good help, the presumptions they made about people like me. I learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to grow and develop under my care. He'd learned to communicate his basic needs clearly, had developed several interests, including astronomy and classical music, and showed remarkable artistic ability when drawing his beloved geometric patterns. His meltdowns were rare now, usually triggered only by major disruptions to his routine. But instead of celebrating these achievements, the Hendersons seemed almost resentful of his progress, as if his improvement somehow diminished their narrative of burden and sacrifice. The 6th year tested my endurance in ways I hadn't anticipated. Patricia's mother moved into the house temporarily after a minor stroke, bringing with her an additional layer of demands and criticisms. Now I was caring for Marcus, maintaining the household, and attending to an elderly woman who seemed to take perverse pleasure in finding fault with everything I did. The 3 generations of Henderson women formed an alliance of entitlement that made my daily life increasingly unbearable. But I endured, because Marcus needed consistency. I was a widow with limited options, grateful to have steady employment and a roof over my head. The world outside seemed full of uncertainties and potential rejections. At least here, miserable as it often was, I knew what was expected of me. The 7th year brought a new low. Patricia decided I needed to wear a uniform, a gray dress with white collar that made me look like something from a period drama. For professionalism, she explained, though we both knew it was about establishing hierarchy. The uniform was a daily reminder of my place in their world, a visual representation of the invisible chains that kept me bound to a life that had shrunk to the size of their expectations. During this time, I began to notice changes in my own behavior that frightened me. I'd stopped making eye contact with people outside the house. My voice had grown smaller, more hesitant. I'd developed a constant tension in my shoulders from holding myself in perpetual readiness for criticism. When I caught glimpses of myself in mirrors, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Where once there had been confidence and vitality, now there was only weariness and resignation. The 8th year started like all the others, with me convincing myself that this would be different, that somehow things would improve. But by now, the pattern was established and unbreakable. I was no longer Suzie, the skilled caregiver who'd built a career helping families navigate difficult circumstances. I was just the help, interchangeable and easily replaced, existing solely to meet the needs and whims of the Henderson family. Marcus, now 20 years old, had grown into a gentle giant of a young man. He was 6 feet tall, but still possessed the emotional vulnerability of a child in many ways. He'd developed several remarkable talents, including an incredible memory for dates and an ability to create intricate artworks using nothing but colored pencils. He trusted me completely, looked to me for comfort when the world became too overwhelming, and had even learned to express affection through small gestures, like bringing me flowers from the garden or sharing his favorite snacks. But the Hendersons still saw only his limitations. They'd begun talking more seriously about residential placement, discussions that filled me with dread. I knew Marcus would suffer in an institutional setting. He needed familiar surroundings, consistent caregivers, and most importantly, people who saw his value as a human being rather than viewing him as a problem to be solved. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd been up most of the night because Marcus had been agitated by a thunderstorm, something that always disrupted his sleep patterns. I was exhausted, operating on maybe 3 hours of rest, when Patricia asked me to serve breakfast to her book club members, who'd stayed over from the previous evening's wine tasting. I was carrying a tray of orange juice glasses when one of the women made a comment about how convenient it must be to have live-in help. Another laughed and said something about how she could never tolerate having strangers living in her house, but that some people were just more comfortable with that sort of arrangement. The casual dismissal of my humanity, the assumption that I couldn't hear or wouldn't care about their words, hit me like a physical blow. My hands began to shake, just slightly, but enough to make the glasses on the tray unstable. I tried to compensate, to steady myself, but it was too late. One glass tipped over, sending orange juice cascading across their pristine white tablecloth and onto the imported Italian tiles below. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Patricia's voice cut through the air like a whip. How could I be so clumsy? Did I realize how much that tablecloth cost? What would her guests think of such incompetence? I should be ashamed of myself, especially at my age, making such ridiculous mistakes. As I knelt on the floor, sopping up juice with paper towels, while the book club members watched with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination, something inside me finally snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. This was my life. This was what I'd accepted, what I'd allowed myself to become. I was a 56-year-old woman with decades of experience, with skills and knowledge and worth, and I was being treated like a clumsy child who should be grateful for scraps of basic human dignity. The moment of realization was so clear, it was almost physical. I could feel something shifting inside me, like tectonic plates realigning after years of pressure. I finished cleaning the floor in silence, but instead of the usual shame and self-recrimination, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anger. Not the destructive rage that seeks revenge, but the clean, clarifying anger that comes from finally seeing the truth of a situation. Later that day, after the book club members had left, and Patricia had delivered another lecture about my shortcomings, I found myself sitting in Marcus's room while he worked on one of his intricate geometric drawings. He looked up at me with those clear, honest eyes and did something he rarely did. He spoke. He said my name just once, but with such tenderness and concern that it broke something open inside me. In that moment, I realized that this young man with autism, this person his parents considered limited and difficult, had more emotional intelligence and genuine human connection than the entire Henderson family combined. He saw me. He valued me. He recognized my worth in a way that had somehow gotten lost in the maze of daily humiliations and diminished expectations. That night, I made a decision. I began planning my escape. The next morning, I started small. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. When Patricia criticized the way I'd folded the towels, I simply said they were clean and properly folded, then continued with my work. The look of surprise on her face was almost comical, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed opinions. Over the following days, I began setting boundaries I should have established years earlier. I started taking my full dinner break, something I'd gradually stopped doing as their demands expanded. I began speaking up when they discussed Marcus as if he wasn't present, gently but firmly reminding them that he could hear and understand more than they realized. The Hendersons didn't know how to handle this new version of me. They'd grown accustomed to compliance, to a woman who absorbed their criticisms and demands without resistance. This person who looked back at them steadily, who responded to unreasonable requests with calm questions about priorities and boundaries, was unfamiliar and unsettling. Meanwhile, I began researching my options. I contacted other agencies, updated my resume, and started networking with other caregivers. I was amazed to discover that my skills were not only valued in the broader market, but that my 8 years of experience with complex behavioral needs made me highly sought after. The insecurity I'd developed, the sense that I was lucky to have any job at all, began to fade as I realized my actual worth in the professional world. The most difficult part was thinking about Marcus. Leaving him felt like abandonment, like breaking a promise I'd made, not just to him, but to myself. But I began to understand that staying in a toxic situation wasn't helping him either. He was absorbing the household dynamics, learning that it was normal for some people to be treated as lesser, that kindness was conditional, and dignity was something you earned rather than something you inherently possessed. 3 weeks after the orange juice incident, I made the call that would change everything. I contacted a family I'd worked with briefly years earlier, who had mentioned they might need help with their elderly father who had dementia. It turned out they'd been searching for the right person for months, and they remembered me as someone who'd been both professional and genuinely caring. The interview process was a revelation. They treated me as an expert, asking detailed questions about my approach to behavioral challenges, my strategies for maintaining dignity while providing necessary care, my thoughts on creating therapeutic environments. They offered a salary that was significantly higher than what the Hendersons were paying, along with real benefits, scheduled time off, and most importantly, respect for my expertise and humanity. I gave the Hendersons 4 weeks' notice, enough time for them to find a replacement and for me to transition Marcus gradually to a new caregiver. The conversation was awkward and tense, with Patricia expressing shock that I would leave after they'd given me such a good position for so many years. The irony of her perspective, that I should be grateful for years of diminished treatment, wasn't lost on me. Those final weeks were both difficult and liberating. I began reclaiming small pieces of myself that had gotten lost in the role I'd been forced to play. I started wearing my own clothes instead of the uniform. I spoke up more frequently during conversations. I treated myself with the same kindness and consideration I'd always shown Marcus. Most importantly, I spent time preparing Marcus for my departure. I created detailed notes for his new caregiver about his preferences, his triggers, and his remarkable abilities. I helped him understand that my leaving wasn't about him, that I cared about him deeply and always would, but that sometimes adults had to make changes to take better care of themselves. The hardest moment came when I was packing my belongings. Marcus appeared in my doorway with one of his geometric drawings, this one more complex and beautiful than any he'd created before. In the center, done in his careful, precise style, was a heart. He handed it to me without words, but his message was clear. This young man, who supposedly had difficulty with emotional expression, had created something that communicated love more powerfully than any speech. I promised him I would treasure it always, and I promised myself I would never again allow anyone to treat me as if I were invisible or worthless. My last day at the Henderson house was surreal. Patricia made a few final criticisms about my packing methods. Richard barely acknowledged my departure, but Marcus walked me to the door, something he'd never done for anyone else, and watched as I loaded my car with the belongings that represented 8 years of my life. As I drove away from that mansion on Elm Ridge, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for a better job or better working conditions, but for the possibility of rediscovering who I was beneath all those years of diminished expectations and casual cruelty. The new position was everything the interview had promised and more. The Jameson family treated me as a valued professional from day one. They listened to my assessments, trusted my judgment, and most importantly, recognized that caring for someone with dementia required skill, patience, and emotional intelligence. Mr. Jameson, despite his declining memory, responded to dignity and respect, just as Marcus had. 6 months later, I received a card from Marcus. His new caregiver had helped him write it, but the sentiment was entirely his own. He told me he was doing well, that he missed me, but that he was glad I was happy. Somehow, this remarkable young man who his parents considered limited had understood something they never could: that people deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, and that love sometimes means wanting the best for someone, even if it means being apart. Today, as I write this story, I'm approaching my 57th birthday, working for a family that values my expertise, treats me as an equal, and pays me fairly for the skilled work I do. I have my own apartment again, friends I see regularly, and most importantly, I've rediscovered my sense of self-worth. The orange juice incident that seemed so humiliating at the time now represents something entirely different to me. It was the moment I stopped accepting less than I deserved, the catalyst that helped me understand that my worth isn't determined by how others treat me, but by how I choose to treat myself. Sometimes I think about the Hendersons and wonder if they ever understood what they lost when I left. Probably not. People who see others as interchangeable help rarely recognize the value of what they're dismissing. But I hope Marcus remembers that there was someone in his life who saw his worth, who believed in his potential, and who learned from him what it means to love unconditionally. Most importantly, I hope my story reminds others that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, to set boundaries, and to demand the respect you deserve. Age doesn't diminish our worth, and circumstances don't define our value. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply refuse to accept less than we deserve and trust that we have the strength to create something better.